The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Okay, our next panel is set. If you could please take your seats. This panel is the technology and the new wars. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this panel, Dr. Rebecca Jensen, visiting researcher at the Royal Danish Defence College. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a privilege to be here and to moderate this panel with 4 remarkable speakers. It's been delightful getting to know them a bit, and I look forward to staying in touch going forward because they have a lot to offer. Technology in war is always a crowd pleaser. I've been told at Politico and War on the Rocks that right after SOF, articles about technology and platforms get the most clicks by far. And these can be the stuff of Tom Clancy novels and science fiction and thought-provoking. And even this weekend, we've had some great conspiracy theories about what happens when an F-35 apparently goes rogue. But what really matters to me is how you fight, and this becomes a human question. How do you think about and how do you use the new technologies and the new platforms? And how we fight influences military and even national strategic cultures, and vice versa. So the hybrid war panel addressed this to some extent, how exploiting domestic issues in enemy or competitor states is easier to do at scale and with precision using new technologies. But I'd say that there are much earlier examples of this sort of symbiosis between technology and military culture and society. If you look at how the introduction of the longbow led to the professionalization of militaries, for instance, or the other way around. If you look at how in the Napoleonic Wars, the nation in arms and unlimited goals changed the way in which armies were used to fight and what they were used to fight for. In the Napoleonic age, arguably these changes transformed the operational level and, according to some, created it. So as we're hearing about technology and new wars, I'd ask you to keep in mind how these new domains and new weapons and new ways of fighting mean for deterring war, not just winning it, for hybrid, below the threshold, and whole of society competition and conflict, and particularly, what does this mean for the institutional, social, and cultural changes that the new forms of warfighting will require? So I'm going to turn it over to our very talented panelists, and I look forward to the discussion.
As David tells me, my brain is activated by movement. So I want to talk about how 2 competing obligations states have in the modern battle space live in tension, and how we might resolve that tension. And what I mean is how the use of modern surveillance and intelligence tools like facial recognition technology, which I'm going to use as a case study, but all kinds of other AI-enabled intelligence tools that are based on large amounts of data, live in tension with the right to privacy, which states still have in times of privacy obligations in times of armed conflict. So I'm going to talk a bit about FRT, which is the acronym, the TLA, the 3-letter acronym I'm going to use throughout this presentation, the competing legal obligations, and then provide kind of a function-based solution to dealing with this problem that I think is only going to increasingly bedevil us as we fight wars on the modern battle space. So facial recognition technology, everyone is probably familiar with what it does. Everyone's heard about Clearview AI. But what FRT could do is what is really transformational. So FRT may in the future have the ability to identify potential threats from individuals contemplating criminal or dangerous behavior. Various studies suggest that AI can recognize individuals registering suspicious behavior from facial expressions and characteristics, involuntary gestures, and estimated heart rate. So rather than relying on photographs or fingerprints or iris scans, FRT could allow soldiers to have the ability to identify in real time known and previously unknown enemy combatants at a distance, be it through the use of facial recognition glasses or the deployment of surveillance cameras mounted on structures, vehicles, and aircraft. The U.S. Army is reportedly developing a portable FRT device that's capable of identifying someone from more than a kilometer away. Turning to the law, there are 2 different bodies of law that we need to consider if you're interested in the law, which is why I'm here, when we're talking about this issue. So the first one's humanitarian law, which pretty well everyone in this room is familiar with, right? It regulates the conduct of hostilities for all parties to a conflict, not just states, and it only applies during the duration of the armed conflict. But we also have international human rights law. It governs the conduct of states in their relations with individuals and groups subject to their jurisdiction, and human rights law applies at all times, even during an armed conflict. So what does international humanitarian law say about FRT use or AI use or big data use in armed conflict? It says nothing, right? It doesn't contemplate this at all. So we actually have to interpret existing law to answer that question. And the most important principle to help us understand is the principle of distinction, right? This says that the military operations must be directed at military objectives. Put simply, the principle of distinction is what partitions people into two categories during armed conflict: combatants and non-combatants, or military objectives and civilian objects. Tied to the concept of distinction is the precautionary principle. Anyone that's ever engaged in targeting is very familiar with these principles, even if you didn't think of them as legal ones. The customary rule is codified in Article 57 of Additional Protocol 1, which sets out our targeting rules. Most notably, the law requires that in the conduct of military operations, constant care is taken to spare civilian populations, civilians, and civilian objects. And most importantly, that those who plan or decide upon an attack shall do everything feasible to verify that the objectives to be attacked are neither civilians nor civilian objects. And we're starting to see how facial recognition technology could be really useful for complying with our legal obligations in armed conflict. What does everything feasible mean? There's a lot of commentary regarding the term. What it means in practice is that necessary identification efforts need to be carried out in a timely manner to spare the civilian population to the furthest extent possible. This test is an objective one. It's based on facts. Armed forces can't be required to do the impossible, nor can they be content doing the bare minimum. But does a state always have to use every tool at their disposal to verify, double verify that someone is a combatant? No. Simply because you have a specific intelligence capability, like facial recognition technology, does not mean that you have to use it in every case. Interpreting what everything feasible means requires common sense and good faith. You need to consider a variety of things, like the time it takes to leverage the asset and how well it will actually answer the question for you. But you also need to think of the potential risks. And some of the risks include the risks to privacy. Okay, so the privacy implications for the civilian population and the failure of a state to comply with its state's obligations under human rights law is something that should be factored in to the question of whether or not a technique and tool should be deployed to comply with the precautionary principle. So speaking of human rights law, what are a state's obligations? Obviously, the most important one implicated by these types of tools is the right to privacy, which is protected by numerous human rights treaties that say that no one may be subject to arbitrary or unlawful interferences with their right to privacy. And international adjudicative bodies have long recognized that persistent surveillance, as well as the collection, retention, analysis, and sharing of a person's biometric data, very clearly interferes with a person's right to privacy. And what's more, deploying these tools in built-up areas or urban centers means that those interferences are going to occur indiscriminately and on a massive scale. But privacy is not absolute. Privacy intrusions can be justified. The text of human rights treaties make clear that the right to privacy is never absolute, and whether an invasion can be justified depends on the 5 factors listed here. Legality, necessity, proportionality, adequate safeguards, and remedies. So given these 2 sets of rules, it seems like the laws of war and human rights law are pulling us in opposite directions. On the one hand, IHL says you need to do everything feasible, meaning you should use all the intelligence and surveillance tools you have to make sure you're not targeting civilians. On the other hand, human rights law says mass surveillance and conducting AI-enabled intelligence assessments on innocent civilians is a pretty clear invasion of privacy. So which one takes precedent? I suspect I know which priority this room would give, but I'd get a very different answer if I was at a conference on human rights. So to answer this question, I've argued, based on the work of others, that humanitarian and human rights law applies during an armed conflict, and they must be interpreted in light of one another, not in conflict with one another. My approach is grounded in the understanding that at core, these two bodies of law are engaged in a common mission to protect human life and dignity. Therefore, because these two bodies of law share a common foundation and mission, they should be viewed as complementary. Thus, in any instance during an armed conflict where both bodies of law apply, they should be interpreted in a way where they do not conflict. Humanitarian law can provide rules relevant to the interpretation of human rights law and vice versa. So how do we actually resolve this tension? As I discussed earlier, the right to privacy, never absolute. Intrusions may be lawful where they are necessary and proportionate to the state's objectives. And whether an intrusion is necessary and proportionate is context specific. This means we can use the precautionary principle in targeting rules to help us understand whether the use of tools like facial recognition technology are necessary and proportionate. Likewise, we can use our understanding of the right to privacy to know whether or not the precautionary principle requires their deployment. Again, compliance with these obligations is both highly contextual, and this fact is what justifies their concurrent application during an armed conflict. That said, their contextual nature creates significant uncertainty for those tasked with interpreting and applying these rules on the battlefield. And this is especially true because armed conflicts are not static environments, meaning where the balance lies between protecting privacy and doing everything feasible to distinguish civilians is also not static. As a result, the question can we use facial recognition in an armed conflict, doesn't lend itself to a binary yes or no answer. The answer will instead depend on contextual factors, which is a thing lawyers love to do. We like to create factors that you then apply. It's what we do. So what factors? The level and control of territory or population, and the level and threat of violence. These are the key factors to helping us understand whether or not the use of facial recognition technology is proportionate and necessary. If we apply these factors to the question of privacy and precaution in times of sustained and intense violence, or where a state lacks control over territory or population, we should expect that a state's privacy obligations will be limited. Widespread use of facial recognition technology is going to be proportionate and necessary to ensure armed forces are only targeting combatants and not civilians. However, as the level of control over territory and population increases or the threat of violence decreases, intrusions upon privacy of the civilian population become less justifiable. Facial recognition use will need to be more tailored to the military objectives to be necessary and proportionate. As such, it would be inconsistent with human rights law to deploy facial recognition technology indiscriminately during the height of conflict and then continue to employ it and even expand its use as the nature of conflict evolves. But this is exactly what we did with biometric enrollment in Afghanistan. Okay? So what is necessary and proportionate changes as a conflict moves along the spectrum of insecurity and violence. A state's use and its operational procedures must therefore be capable of adapting to meet those changing obligations. Now, if Captain West was sitting here right now, she would think what I've said might be fine and dandy, but what the hell does that mean for her on the ground? So how do you translate what I've just said into something that's practical for soldiers in the field? Now, to explain this, I'm going to just think back to the old concept of the three-block war, and I'm just using this as a device to represent how the functions of a soldier can vary over the course of a conflict. To say that facial recognition technology policies and privacy should reflect the block or the function the soldier is serving. Meaning on block 1, for example, where we have full-fledged warfighting, policies around their use should be the least restrictive. On block 2, soldiers engaged in stabilization or counterterrorism type operations look more like privacy regimes during counterintelligence operations or foreign intelligence operations. And finally, on block 3, where soldiers are conducting more humanitarian type ops, or you have a long-term stable occupation, the use would look something like a law enforcement context. Now, I think it's helpful to adopt a function-based approach because this is pretty similar to a military's practice of calibrating rules of engagement around the use of force, depending on the type of operation that they're conducting. Rules of engagement are something every soldier is familiar with. They're like policy guidelines, they're not law. And military commanders are used to applying different rules of engagement depending on what function they're serving in a conflict. So setting up rules of engagement or policies for use of these technologies could be a practical way of meeting a state's shifting policy obligations. But to do that, the technical capability and the forethought needs to be there. You need to set this up, and your policies need to reflect important questions before you start deploying the technology on the battlefield. And these are some of the policy considerations that I think need to be considered. They reflect, common privacy law considerations. I'm not going to go through them all because I don't have a ton of time, but generally, if you have policies set up in advance, you treat these tools like you treat a weapon in the sense that you have different rules of engagement for their use depending on the function a soldier is serving. I think this is a way in which we can mitigate massive privacy violations and have a state comply with both its obligations to the civilian population to protect them from being targeted and killed, but also protect their privacy in the conflict and for the years following conflict. Thanks very much.
Is the mic already on? No? Yes? Oh, good, cool. Thanks for that. I had a flashback. I haven't thought of Kulak in a very long time, so thanks for putting Kulak in front of me one more time. I'm not going to stand up like Leah, and that's because my metric for how long I've been retired is 10 inches. So it's 8 inches of hair and 2 inches of gut, and I just can't get a tie big enough to hide my gut. So I'm learning to be a person of girth, which is something I had no experience with until I retired. I'm also going to start with a disclaimer. I currently have two positions. I work as a consultant / contractor to D&D as the senior advisor for digital transformation. But I also work as an employee of the Ontario government for Supply Ontario at the executive level as the lead for digital transformation. So I'm not here representing either of those jobs, okay? I'm here representing Dave Anderson. And someday I'm probably going to need someone like Leah to represent Dave Anderson. So I'm going to take it in a slightly different place, and much of it is going to be as much informed by my post-fun portion of my career than my fun portion of the career. My fun all ended the day I gave up command of one Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, or as I like to call it, 1/3 of the land combat power of a G7 nation, which sounds really cool. It was really cool. And then I started doing stuff that wasn't very fun. It's going to be very much informed by my 2 years in the Pentagon as the LO between the CDS and the chairman, and by 14 months in Iraq as the CJ7 for CJTFOR as we were fighting to retake Mosul. And somewhat informed by what I've been doing since I got out, or I guess my last 3 years as a general, and then since I got out, which is focusing on digital. I'm going to start by pushing back against the premise of this discussion. I'm pretty sure that Howard did this deliberately, but I'll just read it to you again. In the 21st century, technological development has reduced the opportunity for war. And you could hear the record scratch go when I read that. What do you mean the opportunity for war? Okay, that's injurious as a concept, the opportunity for war, because it suggests that we're looking for reasons to conduct or wage war as a Western nation, and I don't think that's the case. So I challenge the contention that technology is going to make war less likely. What I will accept is it's going to make the war we like less likely, and the war we like is maneuverous warfare. And we're grounded in that. That's what we want to do. That's what we teach. That's what we think is cool. And it's going to be very much less likely in a period of great power competition, and where protracted and technologically enabled war will make it very hard to do maneuverism. So like always, we've been training for the wrong war. We've been preparing ourselves for the wrong war. We have the wrong concepts. So it's not that the war will be less likely. The war that we want will be less likely. I think there's going to be as a direct result of the technological developments, there's going to be severe restriction on our ability to conduct wars of choice, because the costs will be punitive, because of the proliferation of low-cost, high-tech capabilities that can be purchased. They're dual use, can be purchased everywhere. I saw it play out in Mosul. Somebody put together a 40-millimeter grenade and a small actuator and a quadcopter, right? And the first person injured by one of those was actually a Canadian. So that's going to make it, our little wars of choice that we've been really comfortable with are going to be much more difficult to do. And part of it is because we're going to have to spend a lot of our time preparing for the war of necessity, the potential for a war of necessity that is a direct result of the changes in the power dynamic in the world. And to riff briefly on the international rules-based order, I don't blame people for pushing against it, because we wrote the rules for ourselves, and the rules are literally written to benefit us, the West. So if I was going to contest the West, I'd rewrite the rules. And you know who would be really unhappy? The West. But you know why? Because they would have lost, right? And I think we're seeing that about to happen. I like the idea of proxy fights. I think that we're going to see an expansion of proxy fights. I saw it play out in Iraq. All the fighting and dying was being done by Iraqis. It wasn't being done by coalition members. What we were doing was providing them with the equipment. But in many cases, we were providing them with exactly the wrong equipment. Heavy metal. So we were providing M1A1s in a small number to an Iraqi force that could only be maintained by contractors who came from Virginia. So I ran the train and equip program for Iraq and Syria for 14 months, as well as the ministerial liaison team, which provided strategic advice to the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Interior, and the National Security Advisor, and the Minister of Health for Rebecca. The money, it was $2.2 billion in the 14 months I was there, and it flowed from Congress to my 3-star boss to me through a British 2-star. And then once a week, I'd go to him and say, hey, can you sign this letter? And sometimes I'd be 40K for dogs, and sometimes it'd be 400 million, right? That was literally how it worked. So, but when you think about that, think about the money's going from Congress to a contractor, ultimately. And the contractor works for a company which gives money to people to get voted in for Congress. So, friendly Americans here, it's a money laundering scheme, okay, is the way that we've approached our development of partner forces. The last Marine Corps Commandant, the one that was actually appointed, when he came up with his concept for the Marine Corps, he said we need to move away from standoff forces to stand-in forces. And that's because you can't stand off far enough because of the developments in technology. So if you have stand-in forces, they can no longer be hyper-exquisite and super high-tech like all the things that we have, because you won't have the resilience. You actually need small and disposable forces, as opposed to highly exquisite forces that take for years and years to develop. Do you know that someday that our Air Force is actually going to fly a UAV? They're the only service that doesn't fly UAVs. And the program's been on for, what, 15 years, Dennis? And it's to buy technology that's dead, the MQ-9, basically, that is no longer around. So the hyper-exquisite may not necessarily be the way to go. I went and visited 18 Airborne Corps in the spring as they'd come back from the SAGU, and I was fascinated by the work that they did and their conception of zero-day interoperability with allies. And they did and I'll talk about tech in response to questions if you wish, but they did an amazing job of developing on-the-fly command and control systems that could be used by the Ukrainians. And they realized that zero-day interoperability, one of the requirements for it has changed. You need a bucket of code and you need a bucket of data. Okay, it's not about radios. You literally need a bucket of code because you have to code this stuff. And in the first 90 days, they made 170 differences to the changes to the code, literally programming code for their C2 system, which was pretty fascinating. It highlights for me where the opportunity space is. And the opportunity space is the confluence of cloud-based command and control, artificial intelligence, and quantum for the development of both the planning and the execution and the measurement of operations. And this, to me, is super fascinating stuff. We actually, believe it or not, we actually have a plan. with direction that's about to come from the CDS, hopefully this week or the next week, that articulates very clearly what his priorities are for both experimentation and innovation. Please don't ask him the question because he hasn't seen the letter yet. He knows about the letter, okay? But he hasn't actually seen it, so don't ask him about the letter that Dave talked about, because that would be awkward, more than just a little bit awkward. But we have a plan to get after this, to get after our interoperability. The current plan for delivery of our capability is waterfall, and it's about buying heavy metal. And so we are planning on developing secret level cloud in 2034. So the Americans and the Brits will be operating solely on secret level cloud in 2025. So if you want to talk about the road to irrelevance, if we're not already on it, okay? We're not a bonsai military, we're Charlie Brown's Christmas tree, for Pete's sake, okay? Because of the way that we've been neglected is what I would say. So really looking forward to the questions. I spent a lot of time thinking and writing about AI. I'm part of the AI cross-functional team within D&D CAF. I can riff off of that or anything else, and I'll wait for the questions for all of that.
I just want to start out by saying thank you so much to the organizers at KCIS for inviting me here today, as well as thank you to our moderator, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with the rest of the panelists after our presentation. So far it's been absolutely amazing. So my presentation is about the application of new technologies in conflict, and specifically the role that certain emerging technologies may play both now and in the future. The seemingly constant development of technological capabilities beyond what we can understand and apply in an operational context has wider implications in society, in conflict landscapes, and in our cooperations. This is ever more apparent as we reflect on the ongoing war in Ukraine, as well as thinking through what's next. Before I go into the details of my presentation, I just want to situate where I'm coming from. So as mentioned in our introductions and in the conference pamphlet, my research focus is on cyber governance, and this includes looking at how cyber insecurity is understood as solutions and as problems within society. So this means looking at their social, political, technical, and economic implications, as well as how these different understandings are manifest in policy. And I look at how specific emerging technologies are managed, including how they're integrated into certain narratives. So this has included quantum computing, quantum technologies, IoT, Internet of Things, IOV, Internet of Vehicles, et cetera, in different but linked sectors, and try to understand what this may mean in a defense and security context. So what I will present to you today are some of my preliminary thoughts based on one such sector and research area. And this research is funded by one of the 3 Department of National Defense Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security Target Engagement grants that was awarded to me, as well as my thinking in my academic research going forward with that. So the case study that I want to focus on and discuss today is on connected autonomous shared and electric vehicles, or CASE, autonomous uncrewed systems, and the use of AI, especially as it relates to decision making. So the main goal that I want to impart in this presentation is to stay aware or be cautious from hype, especially hype surrounding AI and its applications, including the expectations that this thinking places on certain actors to govern all aspects of this technology without recognizing that technologies do not exist in isolation. So actually, echoing my co-panelists here, I want to say in a bit of a challenge to the framing of the panel discussion that new technologies do not by themselves facilitate new forms of conflict. Technologies are co-created and they're embedded within society and within the environment. Their development and application in different contexts can blur those comfortable boundaries. So for example, the role of traditional actors in decision-making, or the blending of operational domains, or the re-articulation of physical and digital spaces, for example. So applying this dynamic understanding of technology to the current conflict landscape creates a more nuanced space to connect the nexus of digitization, physical and digital terrains, and human and tech actors. So I'll give an example here. I mentioned CASE and the application of AI in decision making. So CASE includes a variety of technologies that are increasingly able to work in conjunction to help make decisions. So as I mentioned, this includes AI, there is an Internet of Things, IoT, there's LiDAR, there's electric vehicle supply equipment, V2X, which is vehicle to everything, there's quantum computing applications, there's cryptography considerations, there's Bluetooth, there's the cloud to consider, et cetera, et cetera. On their own, these technologies do not require AI to operate, but in order to create an entirely autonomous vehicle, there are nodes within a complex system. And these connected technologies help cases make decisions in military as well as in non-military contexts. So for example, sensing and scanning the physical environment to develop a digital picture for the vehicle to interpret and make decisions about movement. So perhaps it's a well-paved and meticulously maintained residential road in clear summer weather conditions, where it's able to connect and charge drawing energy from a reliable grid, where the passenger or the cargo can get safely to their destination, all while helping Canada reach our net zero goals. Or perhaps it's an electric or hybrid combat vehicle, or an uncrewed supply vehicle that requires its own mobile and secure power source with enhanced sensors, its own IOX, its secure vehicle-to-vehicle communications, GPS connections, data sharing networks, all while in a hostile operating environment and unpredictable terrain. Sensors need to work in tandem with new technologies to create new data, which would then be processed and stored in encrypted files within a cloud. And some future decisions in this context may be made through the use of AI, through this collected and interpreted data, applied learning models and networks, algorithms, and process and exchange data points between different connected technologies. This could be applied to providing enhanced situational awareness or logistics support, or perhaps even integrating the assessment of the physical well-being of individuals in the field. What I want to show with this example is that the interoperability and security of the connections between each of these technological nodes is critical from a defense and security context, but also seeing the layers of this living infrastructure that are required to take a physical environment, make it digital, make it work beyond just being very cool tech, or beyond what we can physically see and experience, as well as in different contexts and in different environments. So this doesn't only need to apply to the land domain, but also air, space, sea, and their involving interconnections within a conflict landscape. As the war in Ukraine has progressed, we've consistently seen the use of high-tech capabilities, and also where cyber and expertise in attacks and defense plays out in a at times unpredictable physical environment. There's this physical and digital planetary connectedness to consider here that I want to get through. And that includes understanding the applications of these technologies in a real-world environment, the expertise, the human expertise that is needed to use them, as well as the compatibility with existing technologies, future technologies, policies, especially as it relates to the cooperation with allies. So thinking through these technologies, we arrive at the obvious point that their application is complicated. This is not only because they link and blend technologies, people, and the environment, or have this, as I've said, this planetary connectedness beyond a single state or actor, but also that they create complexities with regards to the governance of all of these different aspects. So using the example of the deployment of cases as a specific technology with potential in a conflict landscape, I've shown that although there is much interest about the opportunities that this technology and capabilities may hold, there are also wider implications, such as understanding the physical and digital components that are embedded within its use, their application across environments, especially in AI-enabled decision-making. From a policy and strategic level, these technologies are understood to have benefits in broader society, but also in defense. Although it seems that government funding and private sector development of electric vehicles or of cases is an economically important field, there are key obstacles that need to be addressed and experiences that need to be accounted for if we're to think through a future of more automated technologies in society and in conflict contexts. So broadly, in Canadian policies and strategies, there's a general focus on how these technologies are integrated into existing frameworks. Interestingly, though, there are some discrepancies in how autonomous vehicles are positioned. So for example, it could be autonomous vehicles as robots and autonomous systems, or as autonomous vehicles as drones. This is important to consider when thinking through modernization and digitization strategies of equipment, processes, and services, especially its impact on the future operating environment as a larger whole. Do we integrate technologies into old frameworks, or do we define new ones? Since the problem space is constantly expanding and complex, there needs to be engagement with a broad range of voices during the policy development, more unified guidelines, in order to understand the challenges. Another area could be to understand the goals of governance, or the types of governance that is needed to address these challenges. So is it governance, for example, through standardization or regulation to reduce cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities by defining and upholding, for example, technical standards, testing, or compliance? What kind of governance is needed? The conflict landscape includes the composition of many stakeholders. In order to maintain a tactical edge, as well as to ensure complementary capabilities with allies, it's important to define the space for meaningful cooperation and coordination. Perhaps this includes defining a minimum baseline of cybersecurity standards for the technologies that are involved in case among trusted allies. This could be through formal or informal networks, such as through the Five Eyes, but also thinking through who would define these standards are, what these standards are in this governance style. So thinking forward, AI applications on the battlefield can have positive applications as well as risks, just as their application does in society. Within a military context, this could perhaps include that lethal application that we hear about, but it can also be understood as more mundane, if you will, like a hybrid transport vehicle or a semi-autonomous system that works with humans to carry, for example, heavy loads across a difficult terrain. In sum, the co-creation of these technologies, their uses, and the problems that they attempt to solve must exist in a real world, and this world is both digital and physical. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, it's a hard act to follow after all these people, but thank you to KCIS for inviting me and talking about space today. Just to provide some context, the CAF has been working in the space domain for many years, but it's really last year with the recognition of the increased criticality of space for military operation, and also the changing security environment, that the CAF, under the functional authority of the RCAF, stood up a third division. So currently in the RCAF, we have one Canadian Air Division, 2 Canadian Air Division, and now we have 3 Canadian Space Division. A much smaller organization. It's nothing like the US Space Force, but for Canada, that works. Now, under the division, there's currently only one wing that we call 7 Wing Space, and that's where I fit in. So I'm the commander of 7 Wing Space. So, unfortunately, yesterday I missed the panel on the evolving forms of hybrid warfare and below threshold conflict. And Hope Space was mentioned because we do see a lot of activities that are considered below the thresholds, and we're definitely experiencing strategic competition in space. I want to borrow from U.S. Space Force Lieutenant General Shaw in describing 3 space ages, because it's helpful in describing the evolution of the space domain and its relation to defense and security. So the first space age, coincided with the Cold War. So it started with the launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957, and then that age kind of end with the fall of the Soviet Union about 30 years later. Now, let's not forget that Canada was actually the 3rd country in space. So after the Soviet Union and the Americans, we launched Alouette in 1962. So lots of space heritage in Canada. In this first space age, we can use the analogy of the Arctic Ocean, in which there were very few platforms and operating in the very difficult environment, and most of them were for exploration. And satellite launches during that time were, national assets for the most. I think they were all national assets, as the cost to build and operate those platforms was very expensive and therefore cost prohibitive from a commercial standpoint. Now, in the second space age, space flight around the Earth became a routine, right? With the shuttle, the International Space Station. And we also saw the commercial sector also make great strides in developing a large-scale space-based capability, especially with respect to satellite communications and application for the U.S. Global Positional System, what we call GPS. Increasing our dependence on space system all across in the military, but also for the civilian population. Now, the second space age also saw space-based capability for the first time being used integrated in warfare, with operations Desert Storm, the Gulf War in 1991. So commanders at that time were able to keep track of the Iraqi troop, even through sandstorms, through the use of space-based imagery. They were able to employ precision-guided munitions with devastating effects, and satellite communication were also used to great advantage, providing about 50% of communications traffic. So since then, modern militaries have increasingly integrated space into operations, and again, to great effect. The U.S. allies during that second space age enjoyed quasi unfettered access to space-based capabilities. And this was the case for another 30 years, until probably the end of the 2010s. But that's no longer the case. We're now in the third space age. Space is a critical aspect of the global security environment, and space-based capabilities are absolutely crucial for the day-to-day activities of Canadians and most people around the globe. Space is used to provide a multiple of services that most people take for granted, and then most oblivious to how fragile those systems are and that they could be easily put at risk. The commercial sector has grown exponentially. Sometimes you can hear the term the new space. Industry has really taken the lead in developing new capabilities and putting those satellites in orbit much, much quicker than any government can do. And then the national security sector is increasingly becoming more of a customer, as opposed to during the second space age, where the space assets were mostly from the purview of government. The growing accessibility and affordability of space creates challenges. As the space environment is becoming more contested, congested, and competitive, makes it increasingly difficult to operate in that environment. I mean, just to give one example, like SpaceX alone, with their Starlink constellation, have now more than 4,700 satellites. And just as of last week, they've had more launches than last year, so already, and we're only in September, they have many more planned, and actually they hold the record across the globe. So it's just going to keep continuing. We have OneWeb, we have all kinds of other constellations being planned from all over the world. But really, the most significant difference with this space age is from a national security perspective, is the emergence of such a wide variety of threats. And the space domain is no longer benign. For those who want more detail, I would encourage you to look at on the U.S. side, the DIA releases a report every year. I think it's called the Challenge to Space, and it's excellent. You can just Google that and you'll find it. They provide a lot of details that in the past were highly classified, but now you can get an idea of what we're faced with. There are several actors that are developing and operationalizing counter space capabilities, and therefore putting at risk like the pollution of orbits for hundreds of years. And then those counter space capabilities go from jamming GPS and satellite communication, like we see heavily in Ukraine right now. And then also, it could be direct anti-satellite weapons. I mean, we've seen several countries such as Russia, China, more lately India, proving those capabilities. Now, at least people now understand that we're all dependent on space and they don't want to create too much debris. So in a lot of cases, either they send the target satellite is something very low orbit that will then burn out in the atmosphere, or they send something and because you need a lot of precision to be able to, because the satellite goes into orbit, so they launch it, but just beside it, so they don't destruct it. So there's way, but many countries are developing these capabilities. And because there are very few laws and binding measures in space, ensuring responsible behavior is very difficult. As we're now so dependent on space, really there's two main aspects that we're seized with in the national security front, and we work really, really closely with our close allies and partners, and nation, like on the space, it's pretty much from the get-go we're working and integrating with allies. So the first one is space domain awareness. Space domain awareness allows us to understand and to know what's happening in space. So it's specifically to detect, to track, catalog, identify, and characterize objects in space. In a national security context, it's to enable us to monitor objects of interest and threat to avoid operational surprise. Canada has been involved with space domain awareness for many years. Previously, it was referred to as SSA, Space Situational Awareness. But we're continuing to invest in space domain awareness capabilities, most notably through developing better analytical tools, leveraging AI as much as possible, and also developing new sensors, both on the ground and in space. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, like a key piece is working with the allies and partners in order to share and integrate various types of data and tools. Which we have a variety of fora and at the different levels, at the strategic, operational, tactical level, to see how we can continue work together so we can continue on the SDA front being better prepared. The second one is resilience. Some argues that the next conflict we'll face will start in space. As Canada and its allies and partners are responsible space actors, it's highly conceivable that we will have to endure what we call the first punch. I mean, as I was mentioning earlier, there's already a lot of activities that are kind of below the threshold of conflict. Like, for example, why would a nation bring their satellite close to another satellite, right? Like, why would you do that, right? You risk collisions and all that. Well, this is happening every day. It's something that really, why? So, and because there's no rules, although we're trying to be very vocal, there's very high-level policy level engagement. Again, if you want to know more about those, I would invite you to speak to Marie Duchamp over there. She's one of our policy experts on that front, but there's a lot of movement on that side. And because of the nature of the space domain and the visibility, the predictability, and reconstitution, it takes forever, right? If you disable one satellite, we cannot launch another one anytime soon. So although just last week, I think it was, like the US in collaboration with one of the company, they were able to prove that within 27 hours, they were able to launch, but this is, we're way behind. So, and because we want to deny what we call that first mover advantage, right? That's where resilience come into play. So by having large constellation of various types of satellites, instead of a few exquisite capabilities that are like juicy target, because again, it's for those familiar with the space domain, it's really easy to track satellite and then target them, right? So we want to have many more so that, just taking one down will not make a big difference, and we'll be able to continue doing our mission. So the CAF is pursuing a number of initiatives to enhance and ensure its resilience in this rapidly evolving domain. This includes a comprehensive approach to the protection and defenses operation of the space domain, and again, working closely with our allies. Involves collaboration also with industry, academia to identify future requirements and develop the CAF space capability, as well as coordinating with allies and partners to ensure that the space domain remains accessible. We want to maintain safety, security, stability, and long-term sustainability of the space domain to ensure it remains accessible for all. So again, this is something that is very important because not only the military, but the Canadian population, like most people around the world, like we want to ensure that space remains accessible to all. So we are in this third space age, and we are at this inflection point, and strategic competition is space is real, like I mentioned earlier. But at the same time, space domain, with its global reach and unique nature, it provides unique opportunities to support our pan-domain operations, but also brings significant challenges that we need to continue working, not just with governments, but industry and the commercial sector, the academia, so that we can address those. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was tremendous. The credit, of course, goes to the organizers and the speakers, but I could not have hoped for a better panel. We have a good amount of time for Q&A, so I'm going to claim the moderator's privilege and ask the first question. I think all of you have hinted at this to some extent in your remarks, but are we better served, given the novelty of what we're seeing, by adapting our existing force structure and TTPs and frameworks, which arguably work, Dave might argue strenuously, but are we better served by adapting what we already have? Or in fact, do we need to rebuild or even reimagine in spite of the time, resource, and institutional costs associated with doing that? So I'd be interested in all of your thoughts on that, just to kick this off.
One of the things that we have to do is we have to adopt the processes demanded by the technology, not adapt our processes to the technology. Or, sorry, adapt the technology to serve our existing 1950s processes. So for anybody who's ever used Drimis, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, we literally took a very high-tech system of systems and made it so that it didn't change for the corporal with the clipboard in Edmonton. Literally. We do this all the time, and we have a tendency to believe that we're special, that we the CAF and we the military, and you guys don't understand, it's different for us. It's not different for us. It's not different at all. The outcome is different, our output is different, but the processes that are enabled by the technology are ones that we have to adopt. So with the rollout of DefenseX, which is coming, which is sort of Drimis Mod, they used to call it, which is like new improved crap. So they rebranded it to DefenseX. The idea is that you customize at your peril, and that you have to justify why you would customize any existing process. So I'm a big believer that you have to adopt the processes that are demanded by the technology. But I'll also say that you can't be static. So much of the technology we have now is perishable. Okay, 4G to 5G. There's a dramatic difference there. There's very few technologies that are not perishable. The wheel comes to mind. Okay, but if you have perishable technology, then you have to be willing to have consumable capability. So that means you need to buy stuff, use it when it's no longer of use. Don't give it to the reserves. Don't put it on a shelf. Okay, get rid of it. Buy the next thing. And that means you need to buy capabilities. Sorry, you need to buy outcomes rather than capabilities. And you need to buy software-defined capabilities, not hardware-defined capabilities. Hashtag the Navy's plan to buy radios that were not software-defined. They've changed their mind. So that's kind of my first take on that one.
Thank you for that question, and I also want to build on that comment and response too, where I think the first thing to do is really, understand the technologies and how they work and what their capabilities are and what sort of frameworks and infrastructures that they require to make them work in a real world, in a real lived experience of them. And then I think it's also the opportunity to change and have a more dynamic framework, perhaps, in order to integrate this new way of thinking, new ways of thinking, new technologies, as well as be able to pivot when change is needed. But that being said, I'm interested to know the panelists' thoughts on this. How many times do you need to adopt new frameworks, though? Is it every single time, there's a new technological development, there's a 2.0, there's 6G? Is that always an opportunity to rebuild and always be in the sort of response to this technological development? And how long are we willing to constantly apply new frameworks and create new frameworks? Or is that something that we think is needed? It's important to be dynamic anyway, so we might as well have new frameworks, new considerations, and integrate the social aspect as well as the technical aspect, considering the defense and security context as well as the economic implications as well when making or thinking through those new frameworks?
So to me, I think there's 2 points. There's on the integration for the integration from and the agility. So I think that we don't have to change. There's some processes that works, right? Just the basic of the OPP, how we're doing planning and things like that. Like that, I think it's gonna remain. It's more about how we integrating those new capability and at the right point, right? We have on the space side now. I'm very lucky. I'm co-located with our CJOC at the CJOC headquarters, so it creates a lot. It's easier to come to, but now every time they're doing a new military operation, there's a line on space that come talk to us. How do we integrate those space effects in space from the get-go, right? So there's that aspect that I think will continue. But the other is we need to be agile because all those new technologies are moving so quickly. Like we cannot just, send up requirements and wait for 25, 30 years for this capability to be delivered. Like we're facing now, we have some project in the hopper that are now saying they're going to be delivered in 2030, 2035. Like that doesn't make sense. We need that now, right? So we need to, at that point, see, okay, we have this process that takes forever. It's not working. How can we be more agile? Like, how can we leverage what currently exists, but how can we modify a little bit? Because changing big framework, it takes years and years, and we don't even have that time, right? So I think there's those 2 aspects that we need to be cognizant when we're looking at those new capabilities and just keeping our mind open. Being agile is also keeping our mind open because there's some new stuff coming online. You're like, oh my gosh, like we have never thought about it. So that's where, talking to it to industry, academia is really helpful.
So I think from my perspective, I'm just going to focus on the issue of data and the amount of data that the military is now collecting. I mean, Ukraine is a perfect example of this being a data-rich battle space environment and the sheer amount of data that's coming out of it that's being generated and collected often by civilians or about civilians. And so militaries are now repositories of all of this data that can tell us so much. And we think about it often in the case of like all this data. What does Facebook know about us? What does Instagram know about us? What do AMEC know about us? But the military is collecting this kind of data now, is using it appropriately, right, in the context of trying to advance the mission. But that data is there forever once it's collected. And I fear, mission creep of some of these tools, right? So I always think back to the HIDES machines that we used in Afghanistan, right? We originally used HIDES machines to identify combatants, like the Al-Qaeda guys that we were throwing in prison, sending off to whatever to identify them. By the time I was in Afghanistan, you couldn't get a government service without having to be enrolled in one of the HIDE machine programs. And then the government engaged in full spread biometric enrollment of the population with the help of coalition forces. But then we left, right? All that data that we helped collect didn't put very good put terrible data protection and privacy regulations around, was left, and now the government of Afghanistan had it, so presumably the current government of Afghanistan has it, right? If we don't think forward to how we're using this data, how it could be used, and how to protect that data from mission creep in a way that could be used to really violate civilian privacy rights or violating privacy rights in order to affect targeting against civilians, and what we're going to do with all of that data at the end of a conflict. I fear that we're going to be creating a situation where we are creating long-term harm for the civilian population that we are bound to protect. Just because you live in a conflict zone doesn't mean you've indefinitely lost your right to privacy. And I don't think we are doing a good job as armed forces about thinking about that element of things, and that does require a new set of processes, a new set of systems to think through, because it's just not been something we've had to deal with before. The type of intelligence somebody would collect when they went out and engaged like a CIMIC operator, it's not the same, you know, when you come back and you record it. It's just not the same as the type of data that we're collecting on individuals now that has an indefinite lifespan.
Great, thank you. Some really thoughtful and
Can I just
thought-provoking.
challenge the OPP thing? So it's a useful framework for industrial age decision making, planning, not even decision making. I think that we're going to see some evolution to all of this. So we'll still do wargaming, but we won't be doing it. It'll be done by a machine that runs through millions of potential courses of action, and then offers them up. We won't have changed the requirement to sense, make sense, decide, and act, which is basically the continuum of what we do. But I'm not convinced that we should say things like the OPP won't change because there's a whole bunch of people, someone in this room will say, you're damn right it's not going to change. I learned that, they're going to learn it too. So it's, and the advantage of machine tools, augmented intelligence, if you will, is it traps a lot of the, it frees a lot of the trapped cognitive capacity that is resident in any freaking headquarters, where most of the work is really just majors filling in other major spreadsheets, or producing a slide that's time stale by the time the commander sees it. So if we can automate a lot of those processes, then we can elevate the cognitive output, and we can start looking at the next phase and all the rest of it. Something to learn with 18 Airborne Corps. Sorry about that.
No, that's a good clarification. I meant the steps,
Yeah.
right, within the OPP. So not that they cannot evolve, right? I mean, you talk about AI. I was discussing with somebody from the industry not too long ago who was working on that. But like, what about all those project submissions and all those paperwork? Like most of this could be kind of pre-written, and you could feed it in ChatGPT almost, right? Like it's just like, and then you cut down in the amount of time it takes people. So yes, I meant the basic steps of what we do, right? Okay. So yeah.
Great. And I look forward to Wither the OPP over lunch, because that could be its own entire workshop. So
I
questions?
opened a can of worms. I shouldn't have said that word, so I apologize for that.
Is this on? Oh, it is now. I'm really thrilled that there are conversations also about how new technology is going to contribute to hybrid and below threshold conflict, mainly because alongside the F-35 fleet that was purchased finally this year, there is a national quantum strategy that Canada's putting out to bolster the economy and also create widespread technology funded by mines to support the Department of National Defense. And with that economic development alongside D&D, I'm wondering at what point does new technology become a weapon? And where is the line? Because once it's a weapon, what does that then mean contextually for Canada's rules of engagement abroad? I think of the Rogers shutdown from, I can't remember if it was a few months ago, last year. Say if that was a deliberate attack from one nation to another, at what point is the civilian harm caused by that then a declaration of war? And what does that say about hybrid and below threshold conflict?
So at least on the, I mean, I think when it becomes a weapon is when it is used to cause harm or damage. But I would say that in terms of what does that mean for the rules of engagement, or what does it mean for law of armed conflict, this is a conversation that's had a lot in IHL circles, is how you do weapons review for technology that is constantly evolving and maybe changing on its own without us understanding how it's changing. So that is, there is a whole subfield of IHL that looks at how you think about weapons review, because that's a requirement, right? We have to make sure that the weapons that we have are compliant with the laws of armed conflict about not being indiscriminate and not causing undue suffering, et cetera, being able to be distinguished between combatants and non-combatants. And how do we do that when the weapon itself is learning and teaching itself new things? So there is a whole subset of law, and it is something that our JAG branch is seized with, but it's hard, and there's not a good grip on it, especially fully autonomous weapon systems.
So, which we have right now. We have fully autonomous weapon systems. They're deployed right now. They're deployed by the Navy. We need to, think that through that piece. The flow rate for dual-use technology, it's changed. It used to be military innovation would then become a dual-use technology used by civilians. It's gone in the other direction. We're not going to be able to change that, nor should we. When it comes to AI, and I hear people talking about responsible AI, no, it's responsible use of AI. An F-150 truck that runs over children is not an irresponsible truck. Okay, the person behind the wheel is irresponsible. And I've listened to some of the discussions about AI and its use in the military, and there's a signed D&D CAF AI strategy that was signed off by the DM and the CDS. Has not yet been released. It's going to be released soon. It got stopped for odd reasons, but the thing that we need to think about is when we say AI and responsibility, we should say that as a country, it would be irresponsible for us not to pursue AI and the ability to counter AI, because we wouldn't be able to do our job, which is to defend the nation. So I see a different version of responsible use of AI. It's irresponsible not to use it.
I just want to pick up on your mention of the national quantum strategy and tie that into new technology being used as a weapon or for harm. I think when it comes to the national quantum strategy, it's very interesting because one of the pillars is really focusing on commercialization and the development and investment in these technologies, quantum technologies, and their ability to provide prosperity for Canadians and for various industries. So I think the focus on the commercialization of the technology within the national quantum strategy is that there's something there that is very intriguing, because a lot of the capabilities that are associated with quantum tech are still in development. So there's definitely a focus on, if we're going to put forward investment and money and support in these technologies, then let's be able to, profit from them and better society, use them for good and that sort of thing. But I think, in those hopes and promises for the application of these technologies to model climate, to run massive models, to climate models to help with climate change predictions or weather predictions, for example. That's obviously a positive application. But there's also other ways that these types of technologies can be used for harm. And I think the other point that I want to make as well is that it's not the technologies that are just capable of doing bad things. It's the actors who are using them, their intentions behind their use. And when it comes to something like quantum technologies, or for example, a fully fledged quantum computer, it's not that everybody has access to such a technology and its capabilities. It's very limited, and it's very much focused on the private sector, large companies, but also the investment and focus with other large countries too. So there's also that factor there, where it's the intention, the actors who have access, the capabilities that they want to invest in, and where those can lead for betterment in society or for harm, or the capabilities run both, basically.
And quantum can protect us. It can actually. There's one element of quantum that I find fascinating that will probably provide us the resilience that we need in terms of space. Okay, because all of our PNT, our precision navigation and timing, is base-based right now. But QPNT is something completely different. And once you deploy QPNT, then we can lose the space, we can lose the GPS and space and still know where we are, which means we can still use precision weapons. That part is really, really fascinating, and it's one of the things that we've asked in the CAF for DRDC to start to focus on, is QPNT and QSense, right? QCrypto, less so. There's other countries that are going to be really, really good at that. QCompute, other countries are going to be really good at that, but QSense and QPNT are really important to us as a military to try and focus their efforts, because many of you here are scientists, and left alone, scientists will investigate things that fascinate them, unless you beat them with a stick and say, no, look over there, right? So we're going to start beating the quantum people with a stick.
Dimitri, please.
My first question is to Leah. I very much like the three-block model with a depiction on variation and violence. But if we look at some of the research on asymmetric conflict, they would tell you that the biggest problem of identification of combatants or hostiles is not in the first block, because you know your enemy and you shoot them, but it's in the third block, right? So that would turn around the logic that you used for kind of a guiding the application of identification. So I wonder how you deconflict that in case you consider that.
Yeah.
And if I may, a short question to the rest of the panel. So most of the modern analysis of how AI is going to, or modern technology is going to influence the nature and the character of warfare looks at a lot of current empirical studies like cyber and drones in Ukraine, drones in Libya, and so on. And they kind of say, well, you know, we see that the impact is not very much. However, I argue that you should actually look at the potential of the technology to affect the character and nature. So I wonder, what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
So, absolutely, right? If you're in a situation that is in a controlled environment and everyone's going about their daily lives, knowing who the bad guy is from the good guy is a lot harder than I'm pew-pewing behind this wall at you pew-pewing behind this wall, right? Like like super easy. I'm a woman who has no skills when it comes to making weapon sounds. But it is in the fog of war, right? When we need to use more, I would say, invasive tools to be certain if we're in a situation like a built-up environment where you can't tell who's who in the zoo and you don't have the ability to just go and ask them or detain them for a short period of time or use other tools at your disposal, where you need to make that decision really quickly as if you can. And that's where I think facial recognition technology has very cool use. But in a situation where it's just but say a long-term occupation type situation, you don't need to use facial recognition. You could go and talk to them and ask for their identification and maybe detain them for short periods of time, right? You can use the resources that we use in a law enforcement setting to identify who somebody is because you have control over the environment and the threat of violence is low. So that's why I say that the necessity and proportionality of these uses really depends on the control and level of violence, because when you need to use those tools is when you have less control, more chaos.
For your other question, oh my God, it's going to have a huge impact. So the confluence of big data that's housed in a cloud, the ability to do compute at the edge, and even code at the edge will push power to the edge, which is something that we've been trying to do for some time. Add that to artificial intelligence, you add that to quantum, and I think we're going to see some dramatic changes in the way that we conduct operations. The classic paradigm is you link the sensor to the shooter. Really, it's about the data to the effector through a decider. And we're working on a concept in Chief of Combat Systems Integration called Pan-Domain Command and Control. And it's the software layer, if you wish, that sits above the data fabric, which sits upon the technical foundation and enables us to take our pan-domain situational awareness, space-enabled, of course, and turn it into decisions, the ability to exercise command and control. And our ultimate output needs to be a decision advantage over our enemies. And we need to understand that. It's not just to do it differently. It's because we need to be able to make better quality decisions faster. It's the OODA loop writ large. But those technologies are going to have a dramatic impact on the way that we do that.
And I think the dramatic impact that AI will have is some of the things that we've mentioned and that we hear about, but also in those kind of behind the scenes spaces or in those more kind of everyday organizational processing data, streamlining services, streamlining systems. That's a place where there's already an application in some cases, in some sectors it's already in use, and it might not seem as cool or as hyped up, but it will have a very important effect and impact, as I said, in defense and security context, but in every day, in education, in the education sector, in transportation, et cetera, and having these data points connected and decisions made about them that, like I said, can have a more mundane, less cool, less hyped application, but still very important.
You keep referencing daily life, and we have a cognitive dissonance problem in the CAF right now, which is that our people wake up every day in the 21st century. Okay, they grab their smartphone and they often get into a smart car. They go to work and they cross the threshold to the 19th century, where they work on dumb things with dumb phones in a dumb way. And that is starting to jangle. I think we're at an inflection point where we just might lose everybody, because the disconnect, it's about quality of work as well as quality of life, and the quality of your life at work should match your quality of life at home, right? And that's increasingly becoming difficult. It's really hard to lock this up for no apparent reason other than that Jimmy said that we should, and then go in and work on a system that's not nearly as capable as the thing that I locked up before I went in.
Okay, I'm going to go to my former boss next.
I don't know if I should start off by saying I miss you, Dave. Listen, my question I thought was really simple at the beginning with Leah's presentation, a simple question. When you talked about FRT and the targeting and the kill chain. After having done this, get briefed, my question is going towards accountability, not just the responsibility. So I was going to ask, and I'll expand it beyond, because David said something that made the question, I think, a little bit more complex, is when I got briefed, and I'm okay that if I give the authority to go after a certain target, something goes wrong, I'm accountable, I'm gonna hold that. Now with your facial recognition technology, you've talked about when and where to use it, but where does that accountability and what is that conversation going on? And expand that to what Dave talked about AI, where then does that hold people that are behind the system accountable when inevitably mistakes or collateral damage will occur?
Accountability still rests with the person pulling the trigger or authorizing the mission. First and foremost, Assuming a person pulls the trigger. Yes. I'm just talking about facial recognition technology here as a tool for identification. When we're talking about autonomous weapon systems and accountability, one of the big questions is always like, are they on the loop, in the loop, or over the loop, right? And there still needs to be somebody there. It's where are they? And the problem with over top of the loop, so not capable of cutting off the chain, for example, is that you lose that element of accountability and you start to like move the accountability chain down. Oh, was it the programmer's fault, right? Like it moves it too far away, I think, from the chain of responsibility and operational command that we professional armies are based on and the law requires. The law doesn't have a good answer for that yet, because I think what you'll get from most people like me is you still need to have the ability to pull the plug per se on an emission on a weapon system to be legally compliant, because there are still without it you lose operational command, you lose the legal command authority over the mission. And I know war games are moving to fully autonomous decision making. But like that's the thing that scares the bejesus out of people like me who care about legal compliance. So I don't have a good answer for you. I would say right now it still stops. The buck stops with you, sir. And that we should create norms around autonomous weapons use that ensure on the loop or command responsibility over weapon systems. But we don't have that norm right now.
So the humans will continue to be the weakest link in this chain, and its strength, its inherent strength. So what's going to happen is we're going to accelerate the decrease the amount of time we spend on sense and make sense to provide more time to decide, okay, and then a rapid execution of the act portion of it. So it's about what we use the machines for, right? So it's about detect versus discern. So you can use machines to detect something. We discern whether it's good or bad, okay? You can use it as an aid to decision making, not a decision maker itself. So rather than have a grumpy captain coming up with 3 different courses of action, okay, that's still a human in the loop, right? We just have something else that can do it really quickly. It's still the boss that gets to decide. And when it comes to autonomous weapon systems, it's about cue, slew, and shoot, right? So AI is really, really good. Machines are very good at cue and slew, right? But we have to make sure that we're the ones that go like this, right? And so for the weapon systems, the automated weapon systems we have on ships, the decision is made ahead of time, okay, to say shoot if you see this thing, and then it detects a thing and it shoots a thing, right? But there's still a human in the loop for that. And that's the key element of our autonomous weapons policy that have been developed in D&D CAV.
And I think this ties in a bit with the discussion of AI and the OPP, right? One of the criticisms of the OPP is that it's linear and mechanistic. And so doing something linear and mechanistic thousands of times through automation still doesn't make up for a missing human creative element.
Right, but it does free humans to be creative as opposed to being
Yes.
machines. Right?
Yes.
So, RPA, robotic process automation is where we're going to get the most value for AI. And in the CAF, you know where that is? That's in the human resources domain. Everything that clerks do can be done really, really quickly by a machine. And then you freed up all those people to upskill them and they become cyber workers or they become digital workers, as opposed to what they're doing now, which is a robotic process. And this is where we're going to have the true value. The Australians created a 1,000-person digital workforce by automating their human resources processes with their clerks, right? So that's kind of where we're going to get. It's about the cognitive chain.
Agreed. General O'Reilly, please.
As a woman, I'll have a voice. So this is about my question, actually. So thank you for this panel. This panel was fabulous. And I love listening to technology because I'm actually developing an app on women's security. But my question is about this, is that gender perspectives in technology are very, very, if ever, mentioned, very rarely mentioned. And it is so critical, especially on the issue of facial technology. We know women with kneecaps cannot be identified, and therefore are they seen as risk, especially when we're looking at drone technology. Who gets to decide standards on algorithms? We know they're biased, and we know that women are being unfairly discriminated against. What do we do? What does Canada do? Because we are supposed to be leaders in gender. We're supposed to be leaders on women's protection. What more can we do on the ground in terms of protection, in terms of aerial surveillance, but also in what we do generally in gender perspectives? What can we do? What are we doing? Thank you.
I'm so glad that you asked that question. I was actually going to ask that question, but more of a comment. So I'm glad you brought that up. So one of the things that I think is really important, and I see this all the time, and I feel like I'm trying to find different ways to express how I want to kind of go against it, is this perception that technologies are neutral, they just exist out there, and they have no biases. They can, if it's an AI, system, it can just make a decision, and that will be the most neutral way. But technologies are created by us in society. We work with them, and they also have embedded within them ideas about their use, where they should be applied, who they should be applied to, and within those ideas are different biases, and taking that critical perspective, that intersectional perspective on looking at different technologies, how they're developed, who they're developed by, and their intention in that development is very important. So I think it's a changing our understanding of technologies as not something external and neutral. And one of the examples that I really want to bring it up, so I'm very happy I have the opportunity right now, is that in facial recognition technologies and software, and I'm glad that you brought this up, it's not just if a person's face is covered too. It can be just identifying someone who isn't a white man between the ages of X and Y, because the systems have been trained on that. But beyond that, even just someone who's wearing makeup, it can be difficult to, a woman wearing makeup, a man wearing makeup, it can be very difficult to even identify using those systems and that software who they even are. So and that's based on the data sets that they were trained on, and yes, those data sets can be updated and new algorithms can be put forward to try to understand that. But I think, again, it's just understanding that technologies change. They change with us. Our intentions of their use change, but also they have embedded within them ideas and biases, and constantly just recognizing that is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, it's got to be first and foremost in your mind is the idea that all of this technology is imbued with the bias of people. And Canada's part of the AI Partners for Defence discussion group. There's about 27 countries that on the military level that talk about this, and I've been to a number of the conferences, and bias always comes up. But the bias goes beyond the technology, it goes to the data, okay? And the selection of what data you're going to pick, because what you're going to collect, because there's an inherent bias, an inherent human bias in that. And it's not just gender, it's across the entire spectrum of biases. But the first way to combat this problem is to be aware of it and to ask the question over and over again. When we get to Gen AI, we're going to have to be very careful that we talk about what data sets were used by the Gen AI to generate its output. Because if we aren't able to track back like a footnote, where did that idea come from? Where did that data come from? We could find that the data set is what polluted the outcome from the AI. So it's really, really important stuff.
And if I may add, I'm really happy with the question as well, because on the space side, we have a great opportunity because it's a fairly new domain to the extent that we're taking it now and looking at how, from a women, peace and security standpoint. And I got the opportunity just very recently to participate in a group on that because, to be honest, aside being a woman, I've never really thought about this, and I find this fascinating. The panel yesterday was quite eye-opening. And so we're looking at this, what does it mean, women in space? It's not just how do we attract more women to work in the space domain. It's a lot more complex than that. And I have to say I was pleasantly surprised because we had brought at this forum a pretty strong Canadian team. It was me and my chief, who was also a strong female MW chief. And then also we have participation from CPCC and ADM Paul. And then we helped craft who presented at this forum. And you could tell that we're way ahead in the thinking, because even it was kind of mentioned yesterday at the panel that sometimes some country will say, they want to increase collaboration with other country, and they pick women, peace, and security like it's an easy topic. Well, if you really want to look at this, it's not easy. There's still bias, and then quite heavily. So anyway, so just so we are working on this. We have a follow-on discussion that are planned and see how we can integrate that. So
last thing I'll say is that there are 4 points when anytime you're using something that's data-driven that you need to be thinking about the gender dimension. So at the point of what data you're using, how you train the AI or the system processing the data, what questions you then ask the AI or you ask of the data, and how you use the results. And the thing that I'm most concerned about that we haven't talked about at all on this panel is then how you use the results. Because we know that women are going to be targeted by this by a collection of massive amounts of personal data. We talked all day yesterday about how there's gender-based violence being used to diminish forces, and for all the different reasons that you see gender-based violence in armed conflict. Well, when you can easily pick out the women that you want to target using this data, or dox them, or attack them online, or you can engage in gender-based violence remotely at a distance, we know that they're going to be. So I think that's something else that we need to be thinking about, is that this data, these tools can be used to engage in other forms of gender-based violence and conflict.
Great. Well, that's a good note on which to wrap things up. I know there's a lot more to discuss, so I'd encourage you to seek out the panelists at lunch and after. And I'm going to please join me in thanking them for a really wonderful session.